This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Otelli Edwards. Tonight's top stories from East Asia. South Korea and Japan putting shuttle diplomacy to work with new agreements to boost LNG and crude oil stockpiles. President Lee and Prime Minister Takaichi also pledging tighter security coordination with the U.S. Meantime, the Russian president is Beijing bound for a two-day state visit with energy deals on the table and a show of unity with the Chinese leader just days after the Trump-Xi summit. Well, at least a dozen people are dead after torrential rain triggered severe flooding across southern and central China. Schools, businesses and transport services are impacted and power cut in several areas. Also, the final report into the deadly Singapore Airlines flight SQ321 points to a weather radar issue that may have missed the severity of the turbulence before the fatal emergency landing in Bangkok. And Standard Chartered is set to cut more than 7,000 jobs over the next 4 years as the banking giant turns to AI to replace what it calls lower value roles. Also tonight, South Korea rebuilt itself after the Korean War, partly through the labor of its own people. Some went abroad on contracts and came home, but many never did. We trace the lives caught in that bargain. Japan and South Korea agreed to step up energy cooperation and strengthen security ties following a summit between Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi and President Myung. Well, the talks took place in Andong, which is Mr. Yi's hometown, about 190 kilometers southwest of Seoul. This is the second meeting between the two leaders this year and is a continuation of the so-called shuttle diplomacy between the two neighbors. Now, Ms. Takaichi's two-day visit mirrors Mr. Yi's trip to her hometown in Japan's Nara prefecture in January. Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi arrived at Daegu International Airport this morning to some 170 police officers, 40 patrol cars and motorcycles deployed to ensure safety. Well, she is attending a banquet dinner this hour and is scheduled to return home tomorrow morning. Now, for more, we've got CNA senior correspondent Lim Yun-suk joining us live from Andong in South Korea. Yun-suk, first up, perhaps you can take us through some of the key takeaways from the joint press conference.
Well, the main takeaway is that both leaders are presenting this relationship as stable, practical, and, steadily improving rather than announcing any major new political breakthrough. Now, before the talks, Prime Minister Takaichi said that the world is going through what she called a very difficult period, pointing to tensions in the Middle East and this wider global instability. And that set the tone for much of the discussion today here in Andong. Now, against that backdrop, a lot of the focus was on practical cooperation, especially supply chains and energy security. And that included LNG, gas and oil, which both countries rely heavily on, and which are now more sensitive because of the disruptions in the global markets. Now, both sides also stressed the importance of what they called shuttle diplomacy, meaning these regular leader-to-leader meetings to build trust and keep the communication open. Now, this was their fourth meeting in just around 7 months, and this shows how frequent the engagement between the leaders have become in recent months. Another important point is that this relationship is no longer just managed at the summit level, because cooperation is now being expanded across government departments, security agencies, and areas like technology and even cyber issues. So the idea is to make this relationship more stable and less vulnerable to political changes. And the message seems to be continuity, keep this relationship steady, deepen the practical cooperation, and respond together to any of the global uncertainties.
Also, Yun-suk, what's interesting to note is that these reciprocal summits, first to Ms. Takaichi's hometown of Nara and now to Mr. Yi's hometown of Andong, they're also aimed to apparently promote lesser-known regions. I'm curious to know how effective are they in doing so?
Well, in theory, I think that is the aim. The visits are meant to highlight the regional cities and move the diplomacy beyond Seoul and Tokyo. But in reality, I'm not sure if that is really working because here, the summit in Andong has been very low key and there's very little visible public activity in the city itself, apart from the basic security arrangements and a few banners that I've seen around the venue. That's very different from this earlier international moments that had a bigger tourism impact here. For example, Queen Elizabeth II visited Andong in 1999, and that really helped raise this Andong global profile and put it on the international map. Now, today, Andong is better known for its cultural heritage. I mean, there are lots of foreign visitors here because it has this UNESCO-listed sites, especially its traditional village and Confucian history. And it's also widely known for its mask dance performances, which remain a key attraction for visitors. And in fact, I went to one today, and that's really the attraction here in Andong. So, while these diplomatic visits are have this importance, the long-term tourism impact usually comes from the culture, heritage, and sustained promotion rather than the diplomatic summit itself.
Good to know. Thanks for pointing that out. CNA senior correspondent Lim Yun-suk reporting to us live from Andong in South Korea. Now, Russian President Vladimir Putin is due in Beijing for talks with Chinese President Xi Jinping. It will be his 25th visit to China, underscoring the depth of ties behind their no-limits partnership. Now, Mr. Putin's visit also comes less than a week after U.S. President Donald Trump held his closely watched summit with the Chinese leader. Well, China and Russia are expected to push their strategic partnership even further, with Mr. Putin saying that ties have reached, quote, a truly unprecedented level. Beijing also describes its relationship with Moscow as ironclad. Now, energy is expected to top the agenda as the war in Iran continues to disrupt supplies. China is the top buyer of Russia's fossil fuels, with oil imports estimated to have increased about 30% since 2022. Now, for the latest, let's bring in CNA senior correspondent Han Yu-Guan, and he is joining us from Shanghai. Yu-Guan, both leaders will be discussing international and regional issues of common concern. What will likely come up in talks, you think?
Well, the official Chinese answer to that question is pretty broad. In the foreign ministry briefing today, Beijing says Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin will discuss bilateral ties, cooperation in different fields, and international and regional issues of common concern. But we can make intelligent guesses as to what they will discuss. The first issue, of course, would be Ukraine. China still presents itself as a neutral, even possible peace broker. But Western governments see Beijing as giving Moscow the economic and diplomatic breathing space. So Ukraine is almost certainly part of the conversation, but we should not expect China to publicly pressure Russia. The second issue on the table very likely would be Middle East. Now, the conflict there has disrupted energy markets and raised fresh concerns about shipping routes, especially the Straits of Hormuz. That matters to China because it is the world's biggest energy importer. It also gives Russia a chance to say we can be a more secure long-term energy partner through the overland routes. Now, the third issue is global order. That means the UN, the G20 sanctions, and what both sides call a multipolar world. Now, China and Russia both oppose what they see as Western dominance, and both sides want to show they have alternatives to a US-led system. And then there is the timing. Now, Putin is arriving just days after President Trump's visit to China. Beijing is not officially linking the two visits, but the optics are hard to miss. But China wants to show it can stabilize ties with Washington while keeping strategic trust with Moscow. In other words, China wants to be seen as an indispensable diplomatic player, the country that both US and Russia have to engage.
So, Yu-Guan, this is commonly said that China and Russia, they've described their ties as, quote, no-limits partnership in recent years. But beyond what you've just mentioned about their shared positions and all these other issues, how are China and Russia likely going to deepen their bilateral cooperation this time around?
Well, this is Putin's 25th visit to China. That number matters because both sides want to present this as a mature, long-running relationship, not a sudden reaction to Trump's visit. But the more revealing detail is who Putin is bringing with him. He's traveling with, get this, 5 deputy prime ministers, 8 ministers, and Russia's central bank governor, and the heads of major state corporations and businesses. That is a very large, very senior delegation. It tells us something important. This is not just symbolism. Moscow is coming to Beijing looking for deals. The biggest area is energy. Russia wants progress on the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline. The proposed pipeline would send Russian gas through Siberia to China through Mongolia. The project has been discussed for years. The sticking point has been price, and that's where China has leverage. Russia has lost much of its European gas market because of the Ukraine war, so it needs China as a buyer. China knows that, and Beijing is likely to push hard for favorable terms. But the Middle East adds another layer to this discussion, because with tensions around the Straits of Hormuz, China has more reason to think about energy supplies that do not depend so heavily on vulnerable sea lanes. And that could make Russian pipeline gas and Arctic shipping routes or overland logistics more important. However, there's also trade. China-Russia trade is hit a record about $245 billion in 2024, more than double the level at the start of the decade, and it remains over $200 billion last year. So even in trade, Russia is at a disadvantage. China accounts for roughly 1/3 of Russia's overall trade, goods trade, but Russia only accounts for 3 to 4% of China's. So we can see that this is pretty much an unequal relationship.
All right, many thanks unpacking that for us. CNA senior correspondent Han Yu-guan live from Shanghai. Well, we are going to go for a short break now, but coming up on East Asia tonight, Australia secures more jet fuel shipments from China as the Iran war continues to strain markets. Plus, Samsung Electronics and its labor union plan to hold more talks to avert the biggest strike in the tech giant's history. Hello again, you're watching East Asia Tonight, and I've got Roland Lim joining us now for the very latest in business news. And today we're talking about Standard Chartered. Apparently, they're out with a major strategy to overhaul. Tell us more about that. What's the headline?
Yeah, it's a big shakeup, Hotel. Retrenchment on the cards, but also the promise of significantly higher returns with a sharper focus on wealth management. Now, StanChart says it's looking to axe more than 7,000 back office jobs over the next 4 years in favor of AI automation. CEO Bill Winters says the move is not a cost-cutting measure, but putting the lender's investment to good use. The London-headquartered bank, which is also listed in Hong Kong, joins a trend of multinationals increasing their use of artificial intelligence to trim headcount. Other banks, such as HSBC, have also mulled moves to cut jobs over the next few years, while Goldman Sachs' chief operating officer recently said his bank's operations are, quote, ripe for automation. StanChart's announcement comes as top executives meet its investors in Hong Kong today, as earnings recently topped records driven by its wealth business. The bank is also wrapping up a restructuring program aimed at saving around $1.5 billion. Shares of StanChart trading in Hong Kong ending the day up more than 2% on the news. Australia has secured 3 shipments of jet fuel from China, totaling some 600,000 barrels, doubling the national supply. The shipments are expected to arrive early next month and follows talks between Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and Chinese Premier Li Qiang on energy security last month.
Today, I can announce that as a direct result of the discussions that I've had with Chinese Premier Li, we've secured 3 cargoes of jet fuel carrying more than 600,000 barrels of jet fuel for Australia. The 3 cargoes of jet fuel from China are expected to arrive in late May and are in addition to the 100,000 barrels we've already secured through our fuel and fertiliser security facility.
Australia's tourism and freight sectors are coming under pressure as aviation fuel costs continue to climb, with both industries heavily reliant on air travel. Now, China supplied about 1/3 of Australia's aviation fuel last year, while also remaining a major buyer of Australian iron ore, coal and LNG. Trade Minister Don Farrell is expected to meet Chinese Commerce Minister Wang Wentao in Suzhou this week on the sidelines of an APEC trade ministers meeting. Trade between Australia and China reached some $233 billion last year, driven largely by Australian commodities exports. The fuel shipments also come as Beijing tightens controls on fuel exports after moving in March to safeguard domestic supplies. Samsung Electronics and its South Korean union managing to narrow some differences as pressure mounts from the government and business groups to avert an imminent and damaging lengthy strike. The two sides are seeking to hash out a deal on bonus payments before nearly 48,000 workers walk off the job for 18 days on Thursday. The chairman of the National Labour Relations Commission, which is mediating the talks, said that while both sides had made concessions, they remained stuck on two key issues without elaborating. While the threat of the strike has put South Korea on edge, investors have been heartened by the government threatened over the weekend in order to step in and to order an emergency arbitration. Now, that would prevent the strike from going ahead for 30 days while the government mediates talks. Samsung Electronics shares ending the day down nearly 2%. Rival chipmaker SK Hynix lost more than 5%, dragging the benchmark Kospi index down by 3.25%. Meantime, weakness in semiconductor stocks also hitting another East Asian chipmaking hub, Taiwan. Taiwanese shares ending lower by 1.75%. Its most valuable company, TSMC, down 1.6%, 2,205 Taiwan dollars. Foxconn down by 1.4%. Now, tech shares fell after an overnight Wall Street sell-off, with investors now focused on tomorrow's results for U.S. chip giant NVIDIA. The markets will be closely watching for signs that massive spending on AI data centers can deliver strong enough returns. Wall Street is expecting another strong NVIDIA's earnings report card out, extending the AI-driven rally this season. Now, analysts forecast revenue of about $78.8 billion, above the company's own guidance of $78 billion. But firms supplying hardware for the AI boom warn that the Iran war is raising pressure on supply chains and profits. TSMC, Foxconn, and Infineon say that higher costs for precious metals, energy, and freight could hurt margins. The conflict has also disrupted access to key semiconductor materials like helium, bromine, as well as aluminium. The Japanese economy has posted a second straight quarter of growth thanks to solid exports and resilient domestic spending. Japan's GDP rose at an annualized pace of 2.1% in the first quarter, beating estimates. It is preliminary data, but it builds on the 0.8% GDP growth recorded at the close of 2025. A private consumption, which accounts for more than half of Japan's GDP, was steady. Now, those growth figures were supported by the country's strong trade performance in recent months, despite disruptions tied to the Mid-East conflict. Exports in March grew nearly 12% on year, led by shipments to China. The data will be scrutinized by the Bank of Japan when it meets next month to decide whether to raise interest rates in June or wait. Another big factor for the BOJ is the yen's weakness, the currency hovering around 159 to the dollar, keeping traders on alert for the risk of intervention by authorities. Japan's finance chief, Satsuki Katayama, reiterated at the G7 meeting that they stand ready to act against excessive forex volatility. Meantime, the Nikkei 225 giving up earlier gains to end lower for the day on weakness in tech stocks. Tokyo Electron lost 4.26%. Chip-making testing equipment maker Advantest falling 3.3%, and tech investor SoftBank Group slipping 4.15%. The mainland equity markets ending the day in the green, though, led by semiconductor shares, as optimism over AI beneficiaries outweighed worries over a global bond sell-off. Now, U.S. President Donald Trump's visit to China may have left questions over what was agreed with Chinese leader Xi Jinping, but business leaders are welcoming signs of stability. The banking giant Citi says it remains bullish on Asia despite growing geopolitical tensions. Elizabeth Neo spoke with the lender's head of wealth, Andy Sieg, about managing those risks, Asia's wealth outlook, and why Singapore continues to attract global capital.
First, out of the meetings last week, I think we, like everyone in the world, were pleased to see constructive dialogue taking place between the Chinese and the American leadership. That's good for geopolitics, that's good for markets, and ultimately we think that's great for our clients. In terms of our business, the strongest growth area in our business in Asia last year was in China. We serve clients offshore from Singapore as well as Hong Kong. That has been a place where our ability to be very global in our advice, to help them access international markets, has been a strong proposition. We've been, growing the teams that are serving our Chinese clients here in Singapore and in Hong Kong. When we think about as we go forward, China is the only one dimension of an incredibly powerful Asian growth story. We just see the stage set structurally for growth to continue in Asia.
I mean, what are the risks that a global bank like Citi faces, or rather has to navigate when balancing Washington's strategic concerns with China's expectations of foreign financial institutions?
Well, I mean, Citi's been in Asia for almost 125 years. And in Asia, as elsewhere around the world, what Citi does, like no other bank, is to create global flows of funds and to facilitate global commerce. And so, the navigation between, the U.S. and Chinese politics is really no different than the way we navigate, many different areas of the world on behalf of our clients. There's always some risk. There's always some uncertainty. But for us, that's the opportunity to really bring our understanding of global markets to clients in a way that makes us essential to them. And so, this is a place where Citi benefits from the fact that this bank has $6 trillion, flowing through our pipes, each and every day, in and out of almost every market in the world. That amount of local understanding of what's happening in different countries, is very valuable to our clients, in particular at times of geopolitical questions.
And just staying on the Asia bit, how does growth, or rather wealth growth momentum in Asia look like ahead for you, especially amid current macroeconomic risks? Where do you see the biggest challenges and opportunities ahead? And how are you adjusting your outlook based on these factors?
Well, incredibly bullish on Asia, and it's a structural position for growth because it's driven by the scale of the market in Southeast Asia, almost 700 million people, the demographics of Southeast Asia, the digital adoption here, the central role that Southeast Asia plays in supply chains. And then lastly, Southeast Asia is in a particularly important place geopolitically. There's optionality, so to speak, between East and West. And so when you bring all of that together, I mean, that is a powerful set of ingredients for growth. And it's why we're investing behind that growth. We are expanding our teams here in Singapore and Hong Kong. And from these two hubs, serving this region with a very concerted effort.
Yeah. We're also seeing growing capital flows from the Gulf region into China, as well as the broader Asia region. If you could share what is driving that, and also how significant do you expect GCC capital to be for Asia's private markets and wealth ecosystem, and how is Citi looking to continue to capture that?
Well, I mean, and we're seeing flows from GCC into both Hong Kong and Singapore, because that structural growth opportunity in Asia is one that is widely recognized. And also, if we just talk here we're in Singapore and talk about Singapore for a minute, Singapore's incredible advantage is the trust that people have in Singapore, the rule of law and institutions in Singapore. In a world of geopolitical uncertainty, this trusted platform that Singapore provides is one that will continue to attract capital from around the world, companies from around the world, family offices from around the world. And, it's why this is such a vibrant hub.
And you're up to date with the business news at this hour. We'll tell you.
Thanks so much for that, Roland. Well, we are going to go for another break now, but coming up next, Taiwan's leader, William Lai, survives an impeachment bid just before he begins his third year in office, indicating the island's deeply divided political landscape. This is East Asia Tonight, and here are the headlines who are following. Japan and South Korea putting shuttle diplomacy to work with new agreements to boost energy stockpiles. Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi and President Myung also pledging tighter security coordination with the U.S. Now, Russian President Vladimir Putin is Beijing bound for a 2-day state visit, with energy deals on the table and a show of unity with the Chinese leader just days after the Trump-Xi summit. And Singapore authorities suspect conflicting readings from a weather radar system could be the main contributor to the sudden turbulence during Singapore Airlines Flight 321's routine journey from London to Singapore in 2024. At least a dozen people have died after torrential rain triggered widespread flooding across southern and central China that has closed schools, businesses, and impacted transport services. Power has also been disrupted in areas. The country's weather agency has warned of a high risk of rain-related disasters, such as landslides, flash floods, and severe urban waterlogging in provinces including Jiangxi, Hubei, Hunan, Guangxi, Guangdong, and Hainan. State broadcaster CCTV reports that more than 18,400 have been evacuated, adding that basic living supplies have been secured. Search and rescue operations are ongoing, as well as infrastructure repairs for affected areas. Severe weather is expected to move east and southwards over the next 2 days, with the heaviest rainfall expected tomorrow along parts of the Yangtze River. Taiwan's President William Lai has survived a bid by the opposition to impeach him a day before he begins his third year in office. Taiwan's legislature voted on the impeachment motion earlier today. Lawmakers from the governing DPP voted against it with 50 votes. The opposition KMT and Taiwan People's Party backed it with 56. But the 56 fell short of the two-thirds majority needed to advance the motion to the Constitutional Court for review. The opposition's slim majority means it was always unlikely that the motion will pass, but both sides had a different spin on the results.
得票的多寡，是赞成罢免多，还是反对罢免多？我想这个就是赖清德这2年的成绩单。我们会有一个非常清楚的烙印。
国人同胞现在在乎的是，大家可不可以一起，朝野一起来拼经济，来拼民生。那社会大众不希望看到的是，在野党这个拼政治，搞斗争。
The opposition sought to impeach President Lai for not putting into law a bill lawmakers passed to increase the share of tax revenue allocated to local governments. But analysts say it further reflects the deep political divisions between the William Lai government and the opposition. Green finance is a key pillar of Asia's climate transition, but defining what's truly green remains a major challenge. Now, from transition finance to cross-border rules, the grey areas are growing. CNA's Ilakia Selvaraji spoke to Dr. Ma Jun, chairman of the Green Finance Committee of the China Society for Finance and Banking, starting with why the world still can't agree on what green financing really means.
Well, different countries have different pace of moving towards a greener financial system. In China, when I began to work on green finance, that was 2014. I led the drafting of the Chinese Green Finance Guideline, and during that process, we decided that we need a definition first, which is the official definition, rather than too many definitions the private sector are proposing. So that's the beginning of the taxonomy, because we realized if you don't have official definition or official taxonomy, you end up with greenwashing activity. Everybody label their activity as green, but may not be truly green, right? So China in 2015 came up with the first official taxonomy in the world. Even though previously there were taxonomy, but these are private sector-led voluntary taxonomy, China had the first official mandatory adopted taxonomy. Some countries say we don't need a taxonomy, the market can figure it out. It's a sort of bottoms-up approach that can solve the problem. But after a few years, you see a lot of countries began to do taxonomy. Now 50 countries have adopted taxonomy, and more are moving in that direction for the main purpose of preventing greenwashing.
that itself, isn't it a problem? Because then it risks confusing investors and then leading it to be a challenge of unlocking capital?
It is. In fact, 10 years ago, we were complaining about some countries didn't have taxonomy. And now we are complaining about too many countries coming up with different taxonomies.
Yes.
Now, the problem of many countries developing different, inconsistent, uncoordinated taxonomies actually multifold problems. One is it creates a barrier for cross-border green capital flow. For example, I'm using Chinese taxonomy to label my product a green bond, right? Saying this is green. And then if I want to sell in another country, the other country said, no, this is not my green, and your green is not recognized in my territory, so you cannot sell. And to address that issue, back nearly 6 years ago, between China and Europe, we came up with the idea of creating a common ground taxonomy. It's being used by a lot of market participants, including Chinese issuers, issuing international green bonds. But 2024, Singapore joined as well. So we made it a multi-jurisdiction common ground taxonomy. So in that year, 3 parties, namely China, Europe, and Singapore, created this MCGT, which are also being used by some market participants. But I think this is not enough. We need more countries joining and aligning a taxonomy in a platform like that.
Yeah, transition finance is also meant to help high-emitting sectors decarbonize. But then, how do we stop it from becoming a loophole for companies to keep polluting?
Yeah, this is what we call transition washing, a risk that a lot of people are concerned about if you don't have a clear definition of what is transition, what is a qualified activity under the transition label. That's why in 2022, when I was still the co-chair of the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group, the working group came up with a transition finance framework. And the first item in the framework is to have some sort of official definition of transition activities. And in China, we take a slightly different approach, which is separate the green taxonomy from the transition taxonomy. So 2 taxonomies. The green taxonomy has now 200-something items. Transition taxonomy is now being on a pilot basis used. Has 11 different sectors like steel, cement, petrochemical. Each of them have multiple pathways, which is defined by the national government. This is how we define transition activities. If you meet the taxonomy, you are considered by the banks as a qualified activity. Otherwise, you're not.
I want to touch a bit about greenwashing. Are current green finance standards really strong enough to prevent greenwashing? Or do you think they're still too easy for companies to work their way around?
There are many different reasons for ending up with greenwashing, right? Some of the greenwashing are intended. Some companies want to get cheaper money and they make up the numbers on carbon emission and the reduction of pollutants and so on. And later on, they will find out by third party and they're penalized by the banks and the capital markets for not having access anymore. But more so-called greenwashing are unintended because, some of the companies, they may declare a objective of reducing emission, reducing pollution. They made their efforts, but they didn't achieve it, right? It could be viewed as greenwashing as well. Using our China example, we have the banks actually responsible for the genuinity of the label for the green loans, right? So they have to do internal checks. Many different levels have to check the quality of the label. Then the central bank will audit them, selectively and see if you are actually having the credential, data supporting the claim that you are green. And if they find something wrong, they're asked to, take corrective actions. So you have to have an external view, someone reviewing your documentation and saying you are aligned with certain taxonomy, certain principle, then I endorse you with my signature. And this guy is responsible. If the company is fined as greenwashing, the verifier, will be having a liability as well. That's why we use this mechanism to control the greenwashing activities.
A weather radar system that might not have captured the severity of a turbulence was cited as a key factor in the SQ321 flight, which saw a fatality 2 years ago. Now, a report by Singapore's Transport Safety Investigation Bureau also found that no fault messages were triggered. Similar issues had also been recorded prior to the flight. CNA's Charlotte Lim with more.
A report has shed new light on what may have unfolded on the SQ321 flight that met severe turbulence on 21st May 2024. Before takeoff in London, the in-flight manager was briefed that the aircraft could encounter weather as it got closer to Singapore. This was in line with satellite data retrieved after the incident, which pointed to rainfall over southwest Myanmar, where the turbulence later hit. But according to the flight crew, things didn't seem unusual at the time. The skies were clear and visibility was good, even 15 minutes before the turbulence. Recordings from the cockpit voice recorder also did not capture any discussion on weather. Navigational displays in the cockpit did not show any weather returns either. When the turbulence hit, it caused chaos, with scenes of broken ceiling panels and sidewall lights, and led to a passenger fatality as the flight made an emergency landing in Bangkok. Days after the incident, another crew that flew the same aircraft back to Singapore noticed the two weather radar systems on board were not showing the same picture. Normally, both radars should display the same information, and pilots typically only need to rely on one. Investigators say this difference suggests the system the crew was using may have been underpainting. In other words, showing the weather as less severe than it actually was. The investigation team also pointed to the weather radar maintenance records. Out of about 29,000 Boeing 777 flights from May 2023 to July 2025, 0.36% had weather radar-related issues. Among these cases, 35% displayed incorrect weather information. Currently, the aircraft manufacturer's maintenance procedure only requires a system integrity test to verify normal operation. This does not detect issues of underpainting or no painting. Following the incident, Singapore Airlines has taken steps to enhance safety measures. They include improving turbulence monitoring tools and rolling out refresher and scenario-based training. It has also briefed flight crews on potential radar issues and advised on how to troubleshoot them. The airline has also stepped up seat belt reminders and on-board announcements for passengers. Meanwhile, investigators are recommending further action for the aircraft manufacturer. This includes developing clearer guidance to identify and respond to these underpainting or no painting issues. They also recommend that the weather radar manufacturer introduce a way to record the weather images shown to flight crews to help detect potential problems.
Coming up next on East Asia Tonight, a look at the lives of South Korean workers who left for Germany in exchange for loans to rebuild their country after the Korean War. In the 1960s and 70s, South Korea sent about 20,000 miners and nurses to Germany as a form of human collateral. And in return, Seoul received loans to rebuild an economy devastated by the Korean War. Well, some of these Korean workers returned after their 3-year contracts ended, but many never came back home. CNA senior correspondent Myung traces their journey across Korea and Germany.
Martin Hyun visits his father whenever he can in Krefeld, Germany. The words, "I love you, rest in peace," are carved in Korean, the language of his father, Hyun Woo-soo's birthplace. Hyun Woo-soo came to West Germany in 1970 as a coal miner on a 3-year contract. He never went back. After the Korean War halted in 1953, South Korea rebuilt itself with the help of foreign loans from countries such as Germany. In return, it sent about 8,000 young men deep into Germany's coal mines. More than 11,000 South Korean women filled a shortage of nurses.
우리는 그 담보로서 차관을 빌리기 위해서 담보로 갔잖아요. 강부 경력도 없는데 이게 석탄이로 얼굴 막 문지르 새까맣게 몸 무게도 60kg가 넘었어야 돼 기본. 그때는 뭐 먹어갖고 60kg 넘은 사람 별로 없었습니다. 소금 먹고 계란 먹고 물 먹고 배를 꽝꽝하게 채워가지고 심지검사 끝난과 동시에 화장실 가서 토하고 난리 났대.
Park Ching-gu spent 25 years underground, leaving him with chronic back injuries. He is now dependent on medical coverage that would end if he leaves Germany.
그분들이 일을 많이 해가지고 많이 망가지고 그랬죠. 원하는 건 사실 뭐 솔직히 얘기하면 한국 가고 싶은 거예요. 반평생 여기서 살았으니까 비행기표는 항상 뭐 여기서 해결이 된다고 해도 한국 가면 내가 거주할 데가 없잖아요. 그 남은 인생 한국 가서 살고 싶다는 그게 원하는 거예요.
The nurses carried the same burden, sending almost everything they earned back home. Lee Mok-jin worked as a nurse in Berlin for nearly a decade before returning to South Korea.
첫 번 성공할 때 68,000원 정도 이렇게 보낸 거예요. 그거를 모아서 아버지가 집을 몇 번 샀어요. 처음에는 이제 부모님 집을 다 이제 샀었고, 그 다음에는 이제 오빠네 집을 샀었고.
Among those who came back to South Korea when the contracts ended, a handful built homes in a German village, a hilltop community in the southern coastal county of Namhae. About 40 families now live here, and it has become a tourist attraction. The relationship between South Korea and Germany goes back nearly 70 years to a time when West Germany faced a labor shortage and South Korea sent its young people here to work. What began as a transaction became something more permanent. Many left believing Germany was temporary. It became the place they would grow old. Before Hyun Soo died last year, he recorded his life story in German and Korean, the two languages of his existence.
첫 달 봉급을 다 받고 제일 먼저 엄마 생활비부터 먼저 보냈어요. 엄마 밥 굶지 말고 집에 잘 있거래. 나 엄마한테 돈 보내줄 테니까 엄마 걱정하지 말고 집에 잘 있으라고.
They gave everything to help rebuild a country whose story many younger Koreans barely know.
And for more insights, we are again joined by CNA senior correspondent Lim Hyun-suk live from Andong in South Korea, a separate location, no doubt from where she was earlier. Really heartbreaking stories we heard there, Hyun-suk, really moving as well. I'd imagine the conditions were quite grim for some of these workers in Germany.
Well, yes, it was. And I think it was very different for the miners and the nurses, because for the miners, the conditions were extremely dangerous. And that's actually one of the reasons why West Germany had to recruit so-called foreign guest workers in the first place, because many German workers no longer wanted to go underground because the work was so risky. But, for the South Koreans at the time, the wages were apparently very, very attractive. Some former workers told us that the miners were earning about 10 times or even more what a civil servant made in South Korea in the 1960s. And so when recruitment drives opened, the applications outnumbered the available spots. And remember, these men, they had no training experience, no mining experience, though that was the requirement. And so for most of them, the work was exhausting, physical labor, going underground, long hours, the heat, dust, and constant safety risks. But it was better than staying in South Korea, they said, where it was still trying to recover from the ashes of the Korean War. And in fact, one miner told his son, Martin Hyun, that we saw in the story, about what life was like back then here in South Korea. So let's hear what Martin said.
You cannot understand the hunger that they experienced during that time. But I understood when he said he went to the army and the recruiter said, "You are so young, why do you want to come? Why do you want to join? You're still young, come at a later time." And he said, I came here because I'm hungry, I have hunger. And the army served, I guess, three meals a day. And then I fully realized what he went through.
As And so it wasn't just for, him, but it was really for a lot of the miners that the poverty that really pushed them to go to Germany. But for the nurses, the hardship was different. I mean, several described the hospitals as being, like a battlefield because they were just so busy and understaffed. But many of them were telling me that they were treated warmly by the German colleagues, the supervisors, and especially the patients who sometimes call them diamonds and angels. And, it was those kind of relationships that helped them endure the loneliness and this culture shock. Though, the loneliness and being thousands of miles away from families were felt every day by the nurses, too. And in fact, Martin Hyun's mother was a nurse there, too. And this is what she said.
집이 생각날 때는 사진을 항상 안고 잤어요. 가슴에다 안고. 남한테 눈물 안 보이려고 혼자서 가서 그거고.
And, hearing the stories from the miners and the nurses, I really realized that behind South Korea's economic rise and what South Korea is now, looking like to the world, there were these deep personal sacrifices made from home.
Yeah, Yoon Suk, and I'm glad that you did this story because it brings awareness to those in South Korea who might not know that there is this generation of people who went through that. But help us understand this, though, because the contracts were just there for 3 years. And yet, some ended up building their lives in Germany, thriving, but there were also others who, decided to return. So what was some of the grounds for that?
Well, yes, I mean, when they first went, they all went on this 3-year contract, and most initially said that they saw Germany as being temporary and that they were going to come back home. But in the end, roughly 2/3 returned to South Korea, or they moved elsewhere, like to Canada or the United States, while about 1/3 stayed in Germany permanently. Now, the reasons varied. I mean, some stayed because they wanted to continue supporting their family financially, but there were others who said they met their partners, they got married either to Germans or fellow, Korean workers there, and they decided to stay there and raise their families. And so the people kept extending their contracts, and some eventually became German citizens. Some of them were saying that they said, okay, maybe next year I'll go, but they just ended up staying there for decades and now call Germany their home. But staying wasn't easy because, when Germany stopped recruiting guest workers in the 1970s as the economy slowed there, Korean nurses actually protested against those plans to send them home, and eventually they won the right to remain. And many miners also said, they had to reinvent themselves after the mines closed down in Germany. One former miner we spoke to was saying that he took nursing courses so that he could leave the mine after the 3-year contract ended. Then he became a nurse for over 20 years, and now he's a football referee in Germany. So even decades later, some former workers were telling us that they still, struggle with this loneliness and this discrimination or feeling caught between the two countries. And interestingly, there's also many of the former workers who are still in Germany who want to return to South Korea now, but say they simply cannot afford to relocate because this country that, they went to help build has just become so expensive for them to return home.
Yeah, and we heard that in your story earlier. And that's why, I'm curious to know then, is the government doing anything, the Korean government, I'm saying, to help these workers?
Well, that really depends on who you ask or who you talk to, because some of the former miners and nurses were saying that they have repeatedly appealed to the South Korean government for more support, like the welfare assistance for the aging and financially struggling workers who are still living in Germany. Others simply want, greater recognition for the role they played in helping generate this foreign currency during South Korea's early industrialization period. Now, there is this memorial square, which was recently unveiled in Seoul, and we went to cover that, and it honors the miners and nurses, but I was told that the former workers themselves had to fund much of that project. At the same time, not everyone feels resentment. There was this one nurse in Germany who was saying that she was grateful for the lives that she was able to build in Germany because it was an opportunity for many of the women to get out of South Korea, especially because South Korea at the time were, favoring sons more than daughters. And so they don't necessarily believe that the South Korean government owed them anything. There was this real mix of pride, disappointment, and also complicated emotion within that generation that we spoke to.
We are running out of time, but very quickly, Yoon Soo, tell us more about this German village in South Korea where some of these former miners and nurses have moved to. Tell us more about it.
Well, yes, it's called Nanmae. It's a beautiful coastline village. It was proposed to be a retirement community for the former miners and nurses returning from Germany. And the idea is to create an environment so that they could come back, still live the way that they did back in Germany. And, the residents invested heavily themselves. Even for this, they imported a lot of the German building materials, designed homes according to strict German-style guidelines that were given by Namhae County. But many of the residents there said that many of the promises they were given were not kept. And in fact, one resident said that they feel as if they were being used, as a bait to turn this place into a tourist attraction. And it is right now as a huge tourist attraction. But the miners and nurses say they just feel that, they want recognition. They're hoping that the younger generation won't forget them and they'll be remembered for a long time.
Oh, I sure hope so. It's a very important story that you did. And thanks so much for sharing, Yoon Suk. CNA senior correspondent Lim Yoon-suk live from Andong in South Korea. And of course, do catch our 1 hour CNA correspondent special tonight on the human cost behind the country's economic miracle, happening at 9 p.m. Singapore, Hong Kong time, or anytime on CNA.Asia or on YouTube. And that wraps up this Tuesday's edition of East Asia Tonight. Hope you've enjoyed it. And thanks for watching.